This is a short video about the basics of statistical power.
To explain statistical power, we'll use two simplified examples. First, imagine that we want to compare the heights of men and the heights of women. In this graph, height is shown on the x-axis, and the frequency, referring to the number of people with a given height, is shown on the y-axis. We can see that there's a difference between the average height of men and the average height of women. Second, imagine that we want to study the relationship between height and weight. In the second graph, we can see that as height increases, weight tends to increase as well. The size of the difference between groups, or the strength of the relationship between variables, is referred to as a statistical effect. A statistical test can have four possible results: a true positive, where the test detects a real effect; a true negative, where the test correctly finds that there is no effect; a false positive, where the test detects an effect which is not real; and a false negative, where the test fails to detect a real effect. Statistical power is the probability that the result of a test is not a false negative. This means that statistical power is the probability that a true effect will be detected. Statistical power ranges from 0%, where no true effects can be detected, to 100%, where all true effects can be detected. Studies that have greater statistical power are more likely to detect true effects. A study is typically said to be well-powered if its power is 80% or above.
Statistical power is determined by three factors: the alpha level, the sample size, and the effect size. Let's see how each of these factors relate to statistical power.
First, statistical power depends on the alpha level. In our example, height and weight are correlated at r equals 0.5, with a p-value of 0.04. The p-value represents the probability that a test will detect a given effect or a larger effect if there is no real effect in the population. P-values range from 0 to 1 and refer to the risk of false positives. A smaller p-value reflects a lower probability that the result is a false positive. To reduce the risk of false positives, researchers set an alpha level. This represents the maximum acceptable risk of false positives. The alpha level is typically set at 0.05, meaning that an effect is only considered statistically significant if its p-value is below 0.05. This also means that true effects will only be recognized as statistically significant if their p-values are below the alpha level. For example, our correlation between height and weight would not be statistically significant at an alpha level of 0.01, meaning this test is underpowered. However, this effect would be statistically significant at the alpha level of 0.05. Increasing the alpha level therefore increases statistical power, but also increases the risk of false positives.
The second factor affecting statistical power is the sample size. Using our example from before, we want to find out whether the average height of men is different from the average height of women. Looking at these data distributions, we can see that on average men are taller than women. Rather than collecting data from everyone, researchers collect data from a limited number of people called a sample. Imagine that we measure the heights of 6 men and 6 women. Because we have a small sample, we may have only collected data in the overlap in the distributions from men who are shorter than average and from women who are taller than average. Here, we would wrongly conclude that there's no difference between the average height of men and women. However, if we collect data from a larger number of people, the sample data becomes more representative of men and women, and it's less likely that we're just collecting data from the overlap. This means that we are now more likely to detect the real effect. Therefore, larger samples give greater statistical power.
Going back to our other example, we also want to find out whether there's a relationship between height and weight. In the population, there's a positive relationship between height and weight, shown here with a trend line. Imagine that we measure the height and weight of 10 people. Our sample may include people who are taller with a lower weight or are shorter with a higher weight. Therefore, we may be underpowered to detect the relationship between height and weight. As our sample size increases, our sample becomes more representative of the population, so we are more likely to see the relationship between height and weight. Therefore, the test will have greater power. The third factor affecting statistical power is the effect size, which is the size of differences between groups, or the strength of relationships between variables. Here, we are investigating the differences in height between men and women. If the effect size is small, the averages of the groups are close together, meaning that larger samples are needed to detect the true effect. If the effect size is larger, the averages of the groups are further apart, meaning a true effect can be detected with a smaller sample. This means that smaller effects require larger samples to achieve 80% statistical power.
The effect size also affects the power to detect relationships between variables. The relationship between height and weight is shown by the trend line. Because there's a strong relationship between height and weight, the data points are close to the trend line, so it's possible to see the relationship between height and weight in a small sample. However, on the second graph, there's a weaker relationship between height and weight, meaning the data points are further from the trend line. This means that we're not able to see the relationship with a small sample. We are only able to see the relationship between these variables with a larger sample. Therefore, larger samples are needed to detect smaller effects.
At the Hungry Mind Lab, we're studying statistical power in research investigating how genetic and environmental factors affect child development. This project is funded by the Nuffield Foundation. Thank you for watching.